Have you wondered how to tap into your reader community to grow your business? Or maybe you're at a point where you're wondering how to even build a reader community. Today we're going to talk to Jono Bacon, the author of People Powered, and he's going to talk about how companies and organizations have used communities to create a valuable asset that supports the business's goals. Hey, it's Joe Solari here with the Business of Writing, and today my special guest is Jono Bacon. How are you?
Good, Joe. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So a little bit of background, how I heard about you for the audience. I was doing research for one of my books that I'm working on, and I think your book was suggested to me by some algorithm, and I remember it. And I started reading it, and I just devoured it. Well, actually, I listened to it. I listened to books. But it really resonated with me because of the work that you're doing around community. And it's one of the few books I've read where, like, not only do you have really great research, but you actually have actionable items in the book.
Stuff to do.
So I thought, for the audience, it's mostly authors. If you could maybe give a little bit of your background, because you've been dealing with a lot of different communities.
Right. Yeah.
And help them to understand kind of how you came into this whole idea. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Joe, for having me on. And my apologies, first of all, because I'm just getting over a cold. I had a pretty brutal bout of the man flu. And so I sound a little bit more baritone than usual, shall we say. So my background is I've spent pretty much my entire career over the course of the last 22 years really focused on one thing, which is how do we build really powerful and engaging communities that get together to do interesting things. I first discovered this back in 1998 when I discovered open source, which is a kind of a technology community where people come together to build technology. And now that technology is running the internet and devices and infrastructure and all kinds of different pieces. But we've seen communities manifest in a multitude of different areas. I mean, Salesforce have built a community of over 1 million people. So Fitbit, where people get together to provide help and guidance and run events. Harley Davidson have got over 1,700 local chapters around the world. There's all kinds of examples of communities manifesting in many different ways. The tricky thing is, how on earth do you build them? And communities are this kind of weird mixture of kind of infrastructure and tools and psychology and workflow and all of these different pieces. So when I wrote People Powered, my goal was to, first of all, provide an overview of why communities are interesting and what they mean, especially for businesses and organizations. But then to your point, how do you go about actually building a community strategy and how do you integrate it into a business? And what's exciting to me is, especially since People Powered came out, people keep emailing me with the communities they're working on. And it really is across, business and activism and, everything from, small local groups to large technology communities and beyond. So it's a pretty exciting time.
Yeah. So, one of the things that kind of got me clued into the book was, you talk a lot about behavioral psychology and behavioral economics and social networking. And maybe if you could kind of talk a little bit about how that has influenced your work and the difference between like a social network and its function and, social media.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's weird because when I started out, I didn't really know anything of any of the psychology. It wasn't something I'd really looked into. And what was the watershed moment for me was, I'd spent years really focusing on building communities. I'd written a previous book, The Art of Community, just kind of sharing approaches and methods in how you do this. And that's a much more very kind of on the ground practitioner's manual. People Powered is much more broader market and general purpose. But a lot of what I was doing was kind of based on hunch and based upon observation. I didn't really have a language or a terminology around why some of these things were happening. And then one of my best friends, Stuart Langridge, was over from the UK, and we were having a few beers one night, and he mentioned this guy called Rory Sutherland, who is an exec at Ogilvy, basically an advertising guy, and he did a TED talk called Life Lessons from an Ad Man, where he talked about this thing called behavioral economics, which is essentially we think that we're rational creatures, but we're actually completely irrational, and our irrationality manifests in consistent ways. So a good example is, Joe, if you go and buy an IKEA table and I buy the very same table, you make your table, I make my table, you will think your table is better and I'll think mine is better because we consistently overvalue our creations. And one of the things that struck me about this was this provides a bit of a scaffolding to explain away why communities operate, why people behave in certain ways. And it was a really critical moment for me. And what I discovered from that was, if you build a piece of software, for example, you need to understand the hardware that it's running on, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you're going to build a community, you need to understand how people's brains work and the psychology of how we tend to operate. So that to me is a really critical element. The difficulty is that behavioral economics is really difficult maths, right? So what I tried to do, especially in People Powered, was to say, here's some examples of things that you can realistically harness, but there's hundreds of these behavioral economics principles out there. And I think we can learn from many of them, but not all of them. To the second part of your question, to me, there's a big difference between a social media and a community. Like, people will often say Twitter is a community, and I don't think it is. Twitter is a user base. It's a group of people who happen to use the same platform, in the same way that the internet is a user base. We all use the internet, but we use it in different ways and in different groupings. So to me, there's no such thing as the Twitter community. There's the Twitter user base, but you may have groups of people on Twitter who form into communities. Like they could be part of, a gaming community, or they could be part of a fitness community. So to me, there is a bit of a subtle difference. I tend to think of communities as kind of a bucket in which people operate and work together and do interesting things. And then you have the tools that they use, like Twitter and Facebook and other things that play a role in doing that.
Yeah. And have you read How Behavior Spreads?
No.
I think it's so Daniel Santola is the guy.
Oh, interesting.
It ties in because one of his big things that he talks about is that to get behavioral change, it requires a completely different type of network. It has to be really strong, cohesive links.
Right.
So because you want people to see social proof and the people around them to do the same behaviors.
Exactly.
You want whereas if you start to have a lot of weaker links in your network, the message spreads fast, but there's nothing that gets that complex behavior ingrained and reinforced.
And I think one of the things that ties into that, and this is something I talk a lot about in People Power, but also like when I'm working with clients as a consultant, because I work with companies to help them build communities or a community strategy and train those skills in the companies, is to me, it's an end-to-end journey, right? So I'll give you an example. I was chatting with a company yesterday, very early stage, and they're building a really interesting community that's designed around executives, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the points that I was making in the discussion, we were kind of whiteboarding some ideas, was that group of people, executives in companies, are very, very focused on value. So they expect value almost immediately. And they are almost certainly not going to go and hang out on forums and social media and things like that, right? So you got to build your community where people tend to hang out. So to me, a big chunk of it, and I present this as something I call the community participation framework, is that, when you identify your audience, you need to get them to a position where they consume value in a community as quickly as possible. Maybe it's going to an event. It could be writing a bit of content. It could be getting their question answered. And even just that onboarding piece for how they do that is critical, because a lot of communities that form will hire a community evangelist to go out there and start banging the drum and going to events and this, that, and another. But if you don't have, your homework done on that onboarding piece, when people come and knock on your door in the community, they're going to get stuck. They're going to they're not going to have a good first experience, right? It's kind of like going to a restaurant for the first time and it sucks. If you go to the restaurant for the first time and there's great service, great food, it's reasonably priced, you're probably going to go again. But if you get bad food and there's a fly in your soup, you're not going to go. So to me, there's like a journey in how you build a community, and it's about being intentional about all those different areas. And part of that is the network that you're building and how you're facilitating it.
Well, that was one of the big takeaways I had from the book was you laying out those processes. And
right.
I mean, you had a lot of different systems, like you had Scarf and some of the other things,
right.
but the whole idea of like knowing that, okay, I want people to join my network, but then what?
Right, exactly.
And then the other part of that was real interesting, and I think it was part of that Scarf deal, is like then giving them the autonomy to go do what they want to do.
Yeah.
Right, define their role.
Yeah. So as a little bit of background for people who are wondering what Scarf is, it's we're going back to the behavioral economics piece. Essentially, a neuroscientist, a brain scientist called Dr. David Rock, did some research in animals and determined that there's 5 principles that are important in how human beings kind of work and connect with each other. So, and they're SCARF, SCARF. So, for example, autonomy, which is the A, which you mentioned, is all about choice. It's one of the reasons why when you go and buy a car, you don't just get the car. You can choose the interior and the wheels and the trims and all this kind of stuff, even though your money is still going to Ford or, Mercedes or Tesla, whoever it might be. The fact that you have the opportunity to configure it is an important part of the buying process. And it's the same thing. If you give people the right amount of choice and choice architecture, they're going to feel way more comfortable, but you don't want to give them too much choice. Otherwise people get confused. So in many cases, you design choice architecture in a community or anything else where people can make decisions. So they have that, they don't feel boxed in, but all of those decisions end up at the same point, which is, for example, if you're selling a car, that you sell a car, but you give people what they want. And SCARF is 5 principles that I incorporated into People Power. Part of the reason for that was because I could have spent, frankly, half the book writing about behavioral economics, and I think it would have A, bored the reader, and B, wouldn't really move the conversation forward. But SCARF is like a good example that people can really put into practice. So.
Yeah, they're especially when you start reading some of that research, it can get really
real heavyweight,
really heavyweight. Yeah. Well, it's funny you talk about that. So one of my professors was Richard Thaler.
No kidding.
So, yeah,
wow.
And he did a leadership course, and one of the main pieces of material he used to teach his class was the book Into Thin Air.
Oh yeah, yep.
Which now there's been a couple disasters since then, but his whole thing was about overconfidence. And when you read that book, all the guys that died on the mountain and climbing Everest during that season were all the experts.
Right.
And the reason they died is because they decided not to follow their own advice.
Right.
So like he's telling a bunch of CEOs and CFOs this, right?
Yeah, and for people who don't know who he is, he's kind of a bit of an original gangster when it comes to the study of behavioral economics. I think like him, and I'm a huge fan of Dan Ariely. If anyone wants a primer on all of this that Joe and I are talking about, go and read Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. It's a great introduction to this.
Yeah, it's a good one to go back to. I mean, certainly Kahneman is like the guy, but that stuff is dense, right?
It is super dense. Yeah, it's hard to get through that. If you're reading before bed, you're going to sleep well. It's great content, but you need a pickaxe to get through it. So
that's for sure. What I thought would be good is, if you could think about how this might be applicable to authors, and specifically, their product. The product is the book, right? That's where you make your money. Audiobooks, there's certainly you can expand that as far as content, but the idea being as an author is you produce, and because you do this, like you put all this work at, and then like 5 hours after you're published, people are like commenting back. Right? Like, years of work down like that, right? But how do you keep them engaged over the period of times in between books?
Yeah.
And how do you, and then the other thing that because I'm into this behavioral stuff, I think authors have this unique position in that they're allowed into their customers' unconscious, right? Like they're given their the stage in their mind's eye to work on.
Right.
So how can they use that? Not necessarily like it being about them as the author, but maybe it's about their story world or their characters or other pieces of fandom.
So I have so many thoughts on this.
Well, let them go, man.
So this is going to be a stream of consciousness. And I should mention, like, you know, I don't profess to be an expert on this, but I've learned a lot of lessons, especially with People Powered, because People Powered is my 6th book, and my other books I was writing for primarily like the technology press, which is a way different deal, you know, compared to writing a business book. And part of the goal that I've got with People Powered is to get these ideas out to a much broader market. So just before I get into the details, just the goal of this is I want the world to understand the value of communities, because we're seeing this sea change happening. And I think a lot of businesses don't know about this. And People Powered is designed to be a vehicle for not just the value of it, but also how you go about doing it. So that's the overall goal. And part of the goal there is breaking into new audiences, right? You know, when I'd written my previous books, I really didn't do a huge amount of promotion around them. I already had some people who knew me in the technology world, and they just referred the book to each other, and they did okay. But this was a different situation. I think a lot of authors are more in the position I'm in today with People Powered, especially if you're starting out where you want to break into new markets. So the first thing I would say is I'm not sure I would agree that the money is in the book. There is no money in books unless you're Stephen King. I think books are a vehicle for encapsulating either a story, if you're doing fiction, or a set of ideas into a unit that people can easily consume. Right. So my old boss at X Prize, Peter Diamandis, who founded X Prize, once said to me, "It's not about having all the answers; it's about packaging them up in a product that people can easily consume and get." Right. So. And that in itself, I think, is a valuable process of forcing you into thinking through how you present your message and how you present your guidance. So, for example, I'm not anticipating making a lot of money from People Powered. I didn't do it for that. But I know that it will lead to consulting, and it will lead to speaking gigs and all the rest of it. So I think a lot of the revenue is deferred elsewhere. I think anyone who's listening to this, who's planning on writing a book and making a ton of money from it, you need to set your expectations. It's probably not going to happen unless you have a railroad hit. So to me, the key there, therefore, is to you make your book a central part of your experience and the value that you bring to the world, right? So the way I look at it is, you know, and I'll use People Powered as an example. I'm anticipating at least 2 years in promoting this book as a minimum. And I'm talking about going on podcasts, writing articles, doing op-eds, doing speaking gigs, doing signings, all that kind of stuff. You need to expect that you're going to be pushing for at least 2 years to make it a success. So I read a statistic that 95% of business books sell fewer than 1,000 copies. And I believe that. There's a massive long tail of books, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so to me, you've got to kind of go into it with, I'm going to commit to this. And what I would always recommend is that you take a multifaceted strategy in how you make this work. So the first piece is give people a reason to pre-order and give people a reason to buy the book. So for example, when I did People Powered, and again, I'm not saying this is the only way to do it or even necessarily the right way. This is just my experience. I put together a pre-order package. So you could go and pre-order the book, and you'd get a 6-part video series, and you'd get access to a knowledge base of content, and you'd get $2,000 worth of discounts, and, you know, there'd be webinars and all kinds of stuff. And it was stuff that was within my control that gave people a reason to buy it. And it might only be $25 to you, but for a lot of people, they're just not willing to part with that $25 unless they know you and they've got confidence that the product's going to be good. And not that many people seem to pre-order. But then you can reuse that later on, where you can then, like I do today, is if you go to jonobacon.com/peoplepowered, you can go and buy the book, but then you can unlock a whole set of additional perks and benefits as part of it. So I think the value add thing is really important. I definitely focus on that. The other thing that I would suggest as well is, and this gets back to the community piece, is constantly growing your profile, whether that's through your social media accounts, that could be building an email list. a friend of mine who's an expert in like Facebook advertising said that in the advertising world, a world I know nothing about, people say that, you've got to be able, you got to date before you get married. And what that means is before they buy your book, they're going to want to know who you are, know the content that you produce, and have faith in that before they're willing to part with the $25 for the book, right? So lots of blog posts, lots of speaking slots, lots of podcast appearances, all that kind of stuff I think is really valuable. Now, one of the things I would suggest, and I did this, is that when you get your book deal, and if you negotiate a decent advance, use that money. Don't take that money and put it in your bank account. Use that money to hire a PR firm, right? And then they can get you on podcasts. They can get you in op-eds or whatever else. And you're building your kind of broader reputation. And it seems counterintuitive because you're chucking money at PR and you're not putting it into your, kids lunchbox, right? But you it's all about building that growth, because I think when you build your platform and people know that you're an expert in whatever you're doing, it's going to make it easier to sell the book, and it's going to make it easier to have future books as well.
Yeah, and I certainly, from my experiences on the nonfiction side, I always, when I talk to people about that, I say, you don't expect this to be the next Dave Ramsey book, right?
Right.
But what it will do is it will get you busy. Like whatever, if you have other stuff to do, that means you have to have those other things. But a large part of the audience is actually fiction writers,
right.
and they're indie authors. So they're not even going to ever take a book deal unless it's going to be a 6-7 figure book deal, because they're making so much money now with their fiction. But what they're coping with is a completely different kind of set of problems, in the sense of, let's say you're a fantasy writer or you're a romance writer. Their audience can read a book a day.
Right.
So there's no way that they can keep up with that pace of writing. And what their big concern is like, okay, I put out this book, my readers read it. Now I need another month. These people that are really writing fast can get a book done in a month, right? But I want to make sure they're still around at the end of whatever that period is. If it's a month, 6 months, a year, if you're George R. R. Martin, whatever he's done now. But the idea of how you can use your system to help the authors think about caring for, and maybe even a better way of putting it is getting their community to care for each other while they're waiting for the next book.
Right. Wait, there's a couple of interesting things I think wrapped up in that, because one is, the cadence of how you push out new products. And one approach is that you keep pumping out books, and then people who've got new things, they keep buying it. I think if you can maintain quality, that makes a lot of sense. I actually am generally of the view that it's better to create a really solid product and then push it hard, and sell a lot of that unit, instead of just pumping out lots and lots of new products. Because my worry is that there is an element of, I think, oversaturating the market with your content. I'll give an example of this, and it's Kevin Smith, the director. Kevin Smith has pumped out a ton of movies, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, and he's got a really hardcore following of people who love his stuff, but it's incredibly niche. And I think he's struggled to garner a broader level of market awareness, because I think he put out maybe too many things too quickly, and he's instead focused on his audience explicitly. And I think if you build that audience, like he built that audience in his early stages, like when he had Clarks and Mallrats and whatever else, and they're awesome movies. So he built that because I think he focused in those earlier days on a small number of movies that focused on a narrative, and they did really well. And then he started pumping out other stuff, and it didn't really hit as much. So to me, there's an element of really, really pushing, I think, on a product. Like a good example is Bruce Dickinson, the singer of Iron Maiden, released his autobiography, and he's It came out 2 years ago, and he's still traveling around doing speaking gigs and pushing it. So I think that's one element. But to me, the other piece is building a community around you and your work, right? So people don't get into a specific album or a specific book. They get into an author or a band, I think.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is, from a pragmatic perspective, with how you build your community, is having a place where your fans can get together and talk to each other, such as an online forum or even a Facebook group. It's a regular stream of news and getting out there. It's growing your social media accounts. It's going and doing speaking gigs. You got to inject yourself into the mindset of your audience and be relevant. Now, it's easier for nonfiction authors to do this because, for example, my PR firm have got me commenting on news events and things like that. So I'm appearing in the press. But if you're a fiction author, it's more difficult to do that. But then if you're a fiction author, you've got the opportunity to maybe visualize different parts of your story, or have little spin-off stories, or write shorts that you can push out there. So you're always giving your audience something to chew on in between your big releases of new books.
Well, yeah, and there's all different versions of that. Like, there's an author you may not be familiar called Chris Kennedy.
Right.
He works with a bunch of other authors in what's called the Four Horsemen universe. It's a science fiction, giant robots and military science fiction.
Right.
I mean, he doesn't do traditional advertising, but he's at all these conventions, and he's got a fan base where people, are cosplaying his characters in his books.
Yeah.
And that, that to me, he kind of developed organically, but he's figured out a way to let his fans do that.
Right.
And I think that's where you have a little bit of the secret sauce. And, Chris figured that out great, but like, how does somebody build something like that?
Right.
Because in essence, those fans are kind of taking care of themselves in the interim.
Right.
If that makes sense, because it's hard when you're the author and it's like, I got to write 5,000 words today, and I got to go do all these posts, and I got to do this, and I got to hold their hand. Like, so could you talk to some of the things that
you can have them do?
And I think one of the things in your books that was really cool is you explained how you allowed these kind of people to level up and to take roles and to fill that status piece themselves while helping the community help itself.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that I think, and at the center of great communities is, if you give people meaningful things that they can do, it's amazing what results you can get. And I'll give you a non-literary example of this, and then I'll walk through how you can approach it and how to kind of build it. So I've been playing in bands for years, and I started a band years ago called Severed Fifth. And one of the things that we did is we kind of crowdfunded our album and went and recorded it. And we put all the music out there completely free of charge for people to listen to. But we also we were very open in our community playing a role in improving the band and shaping the band. So we had people creating wallpapers for computers. We had someone working on a video game. Someone created like a news fanzine type thing. There was all kinds of different elements. And the key here is that we said to our community, as it was new and burgeoning, you can play a role in this. It's not just the music coming from the band members. You're part of this. So I think how you transition this into a literary setting is sit down, first of all, and say, like, what could I allow my audience to do? So let's say, for example, you're a fiction author. What do you want them to do? Well, one element of this could be just getting people together so they can have conversations about the stories, and the character and the background and the origin of all the different elements of what you're doing. So people listen or read the book, and then they can go and play a role in that. Another piece could be encouraging a community of artists for creating imagery and depictions of the stories that are within your book. Another element of this could be actually encouraging people to produce fan fiction and sharing that fan fiction on your website. And maybe you have a competition where you as the author go and choose some of the fan fiction and be very specific. You've got 1,000 words, and submit them, and there'll be prizes for this. Another piece could be your community, providing recommendations around which events should you go and speak at, or it could be working with YouTubers to produce visual, like video depictions of the stories. There's all kinds of ways in which I think you can get creative in how people can play a role in this for people who are really enjoying your work. The next piece then is to say, okay, which of these roles are the most critical? I'm going to pick 2 or 3 of them. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create the necessary community pieces to be able to facilitate that. So it could be setting up a forum such as Discourse, which is completely free to use. It could be setting up a website and having a blog where you can go and post news about this kind of stuff and continuing to grow out your social media. But then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you incentivize people around that. And part of the incentivization process is when you identify what you want people to do, when people do that, you recognize it and you reward it where appropriately. Now, in some cases, rewarding it can be just, posting a blog post about it and talking about it. If people are a fan of you, then that means everything, right? Like I'm a huge fan of Megadeth, right? And if Dave Mustaine from Megadeth ever mentioned me in a blog post or a social media post, I'd be thrilled. Or it could be, if you've got a bit of money behind you, it could be, sending them signed copies of your book or limited edition prints or whatever it might be. It's all about, I think, saying you're building a universe in which your fans and which your readers play an active role in shaping that universe. Joss Whedon, for example, would have characters in some of his work, like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and other things. There's all kinds of different ways, I think, in which you can weave people in, and then that can transition out into crowdfunding and other pieces that maybe support your work. But the key thing is a place where people can hang out, specific things that they can do to keep them occupied, and recognizing great contributions. I think when you have those and you continue to build your growth and visibility, you've then got a killer community on its way.
Yeah. Well, I think about, there's an author, Martha Carr. She writes urban fantasy. She's, top 100 author.
Right.
She, when she goes to a town, she always sets up lunches.
Right.
And she brings books, for signed books. And, there's always a fan that deals with the logistics, right? There's always somebody that sticks their hand up and says, I'll find the restaurant for us.
Yeah.
So, I've been at these events, and she says people drive 100 miles.
Oh, it's
just to eat lunch.
Well, and I think part of this, and this kind of gets back to our previous discussion earlier, Joe, about the behavioral economics. One of the most powerful components in communities is people feel like, well, 2 things: people feeling like the things that they do have got meaning. And then when they feel a sense of belonging, of being part of that community. So if, let's say I'm a massive Joe Slurry fan, right? And Joe comes to town to do a speaking slot in San Francisco. If I can pick you up from the airport and I can coordinate a reception for Joe fans afterwards, and then you say, you know what, Jono, I really appreciate all of the work that you did. This was really cool. Thank you so much. And maybe you mentioned me on your social media network. That feels meaningful to me. It's rewarding and it's meaningful. And people love that. But obviously there's specific instances that's going to happen. That's not going to necessarily happen for everybody. But if I'm part of the Joe Slurry community and I'm hanging out and I'm meeting other people who are sharing feedback on what you're doing, the work that you're doing, and broader work around authors and helping authors to be successful. If I'm going there all the time and hanging out and getting to know these people and they're becoming friends, that builds a sense of belonging. When you have those 2 pieces, then it's amazing how far people will go to help the community.
Well, and to that point, one of the things that I thought was interesting was you focused a lot in the book about, for a certain echelon of people, that it needs to be really personal, right? That you don't like have an automated system to deal with whatever.
Right.
Like those are people that you invite to the company headquarters, and you go above and beyond and give them special access.
Yes.
You want to kind of unpack that for people? Yeah.
Yeah. So at the core of what makes communities really successful is it's building a relationship between people, right? So we often see a lot of talk on the internet about the mechanics around marketing, around email lists and conversion and Facebook retargeting and advertising and all this kind of stuff. But really what it fundamentally boils down to is, if I join a community, can I play a role that is respected and recognized, that feels meaningful to me, and where I can enjoy being around the people who are there? So the more we index on the personal experience, the better. And one of the examples I give in the book was a company that I work with, where people who would be very active and participate in the community would kind of reach a level, if you will. And one of the benefits that they would get is they get, swag and whatever else. But one of the main things, they get a phenomenal amount of recognition in the community, but also they get access to an email address that went straight to the leadership team. I called it the bat phone. And people, frankly, basically never used it. It was very rarely used. But they loved the fact that they had access, that the company was willing, that they said, you are critical to us. You're a critical stakeholder. And I said to the execs, like, you need to respond same day. There's no screwing around here if you're going to do this. Yeah. And it's that level of personal engagement. Now, the tricky thing is that as communities get bigger, like if you've got a community of less than 100 people, you can basically know everybody. But when you start getting into communities of hundreds and thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people, it's very difficult to have those personal relationships because there's too many people. Yeah. And that's why I kind of designed the approach in People Powered, is how you can predictively build that. And the summary is, you're intentional about the experience of how people come in, but then you encourage your community members to mentor each other, right? So it's less dependent on Joe, engaging with your community members directly. It's more that you'll have other community members who can help those new people to get started and to feel that sense of purpose and meaning and all the rest of it. And it really is about fundamentally being intentional. My view is very simple, is people are super intentional about the product, whether it's a book, whether it's a piece of software, whatever it might be. You've got to be as intentional about your community experience. And the comparison I have here goes back to the restaurant. Like, if you go to a restaurant and booking a table's easy, and when you show up, you get seated and they bring you water, they bring you menu, you pick your food. Everything is really well structured and laid out and not too pushy, just the right cadence. If you experience that, you go away with an amazing kind of perspective. And the restaurants that do well are very intentional about all of those different steps. And it's the same thing with communities.
Yeah, I thought that's a really powerful thing, is to understand that intentionality and to build a system, right? It's a lot of work, right?
Right. Yeah.
But if you're doing it as a scale, it's not as much work, and you can kind of figure out the parts that break. But
right.
Knowing that you're building this thing from the ground up, that you're not going to be trying to juggle all the balls, that you're going to have other people do certain things.
Right. Yeah.
Not only because it's going to relieve you of that work, but because it makes them feel valuable.
Well, and that's it. It's frankly, it sounds like a cliche, but it really is about kind of intentional leadership, like great leaders. It's not about, them coming up with these genius, otherworldly decisions. It's about, how do I enable my team to be the best? And that's what you're doing with your community, is you're saying, let's say you have a community of 100 people. This is 100 people with experience, expertise, time. They're a network of minds. How can we enable those people to have a great time in our author community and be able to help our community grow? And it's enabling them to play a role in how you do that. And that's what a lot of what I talk about in the book is, if somebody comes in and they participate and they're playing a role in your community, you know them by name. Like, let's learn from them. Let's let them play a creative role in, well, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could organize this event. Maybe we could do an online competition. Maybe we could explore these different areas. Because again, when they play a role in shaping the community, it's meaningful work, and it builds a sense of belonging. So then what you're doing is you're empowering people. The thing that companies and individuals often struggle with is they don't feel comfortable kind of not so much losing control, but giving control. And if you don't give control, it'll always bottleneck on you. And that's part of the trick.
Yeah. Well, Well, and you cut yourself off from the surprise that the people can come up with, right? Like, when you get that community feeling that they can take this and create value themselves. I mean, you talk about it in the book. Some of the most valuable assets end up becoming the community.
Oh, for sure. And it's amazing also when people are, when they feel empowered and they're having a good time and they feel part of something. One of the biggest questions that people ask me is, how do I get community members to do stuff? And the answer is fairly simple. Just ask them. In many cases, if you say, could you help with this? People will. I'll give you a concrete example. Years ago, I used to do a podcast with some friends in the UK, a different podcast. I do a couple of podcasts right now. And we wanted to run a live event. We had no money. And what we did is we basically just had our friends, we all helped out, like I took care of the speakers, somebody else took care of the exhibition area, another person was producing the design, another person was helping to find some sponsors to pay for some of this stuff, between about 5 or 6 of us in preparation for the event, we managed to put this event on, and then we had about 10 people on the ground on the day who were helping out. But we went into great detail about, for example, celebrating the helpers on the day, getting them to stand up and get a round of applause, and really highlighting them. It's amazing what you can do with a little. And the good news, I think, for people listening to this, especially for relatively new authors or people who are thinking about this community, it's easier than ever to do it because there's tools out there that are free to use. There's loads of guidance out there for how to get started. I'd recommend people take a look at People Power because I think it's an encapsulated way of the value of this and how to do it. But it's easier than ever to get started on this. And I think especially for authors, there's so much potential because people love spending time in communities where they're for entertainment value or for personal enrichment, and education. So,
well, I mean, there's, for me, there's a lot of pieces that hook together. So when you look at any of the research around cumulative advantage and the superstar effect, and why is it that, a small group of people collect this big audience? There's all kinds of research that's been done. It has nothing to do with talent. And I know from authors, I won't get into who I think is talented or not. But there are some people that are making a lot of money that if you couldn't make it through their book because you're not their audience.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But because that audience builds and builds, we like that. One of the things we like about, books and movies, it's talking about it and being part of
it's
something.
Part of the experience, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. I completely agree with you.
I heard, I might be off on this number, but I heard they're selling $12 million a month of custom-made lightsabers at Galaxy's Edge.
Oh, I totally believe that.
Right? So you do, like, how could they get more money out of a franchise like Star Wars?
Right.
Well, there are people that are standing in line prepared to spend hundreds of dollars to get a custom-made lightsaber in a particular experience at that park.
Yeah.
And they're coming month after month.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. And I think part of it, though, and just in the interest of setting expectations, I think to do this and to do it well, I think people need to accept that there's a grind. There's a big grind. And the comparison I would use here is I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy. My wife and I go to see loads of stand-ups. And when you listen to stand-up comedians talk about how they got to where they are, one of the things that they say is they're up every night at a comedy club or hoping to get up at a comedy club for 5 minutes. And they have to give out flyers. And there's a great show called Crashing that kind of goes through this with this guy called Pete. I forget his name now, but Pete Holmes. So when you see these famous stand-up comedians, they have grounded out. They've traveled around the country. They've stayed in terrible apartments just so they can get their 10 minutes on stage so they can refine their material. And part of it is they refine their material at every show. And then they spend weeks and weeks on the road. And then they have enough material to do a special. And then they do a special, goes up on Netflix, and off they go. And the cycle repeats. I think there's a comparison with authors and with communities is that, part of it is just grinding on podcasts and writing articles and news and your social media and getting out to conventions and doing all these different things. And sometimes it can be exhausting. You can be like, why am I doing this? I'm tired. I'm sick of doing this. You know, the spark goes out. But if you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, you'll grow and you'll grow and you'll grow. And it can take years. But I think if you're always innovating and always trying to do new things and always, you know, taking a multimedia approach to things, and you've got the energy in you to have the grind, then you can generate results. What's not going to happen is, you know, just setting up an online forum is suddenly all these people are going to manifest out of nowhere and form your community. You're going to have to do a lot more work than that. So,
yeah, it is one of these things that's tough because, you know, we're all sensitive to the superstars, the people that have done well. And
right.
I can drop names all day long of authors that are doing 6 and 7 figures.
Right.
They're a very, very, very small percentage of the people that write a book. And that's why this podcast is the business of writing, right? We're talking about treating your writing like a business and understanding that, yeah, you love to write and you have stories to tell, but if you want to make money, like that's one thing. You can write books all day long, but if you want to make money writing books, now you have to work at it, because you can publish a book for free on Amazon.
Yep, exactly. You know, the writing the book, I think, is the easy bit.
and
it's not easy to write a good book, I think, but it is the you got to turn into a marketing machine, I think, to do it well. And it's probably going to be harder for fiction authors because you got to, like I said earlier on, you know, with People Powered is a good example. Like, I've written People Powered. I've already more than made enough money just from consulting from People Powered and speaking. And the book's been out at this time for 4 months. But with fiction, you've got to sell a lot of volume to do that, unless you start getting paid speaking gigs if you're a big deal. But
I think what most people don't understand is when you look at the supply and demand of the book market. So there's an enormous supply of nonfiction,
right,
against the readers of nonfiction. On the fiction side, the readers are voracious readers, right? Like, just the segment of romance alone is $1 billion industry.
Right.
Those people just churn through books.
Yeah.
So if you can hit your market, there's a bigger marketplace there.
Yeah.
And they're that's their thing, right? Like, you and I were business guys, we're doing stuff. We'll buy a business book. We'll spend $25 on it. We'll read a third of it.
Right.
Whereas, especially with the advent of the ebook, these readers just burn through this stuff. And so there is a lot of money to be made in fiction, but everything you said is absolutely true. You have to work at it. You have to treat it like a business. You have to understand that it's going to take you a long time to find your voice and to find your audience. Yeah. And then if you ignore your audience, they'll go somewhere else.
Yeah. And like I say, I think the good news here is it's all to play for. You know, it reminds me of back in the day when I was younger, for example, trying to get a record deal, you know, sending in tapes to record labels. Now you put your music online. Now people can self-publish. There's more opportunity. There's more noise and more competition, but there's more opportunity than ever, I think, before. I think the key thing is look at your future as you're an author and you're also a marketeer and a community manager. And look at growing those skills outside of just being an author and writing better and better books. But it's absolutely all to play for. So
great. Well, it's good to have you on. Before we kind of break here, why don't you tell everybody about what you're up to right now and how they can contact you and whatever else you want to shamelessly plug.
So people can find out more about the work that I do at jonobacon.com, Jono Bacon, that's like the meat.com. My new book, People Powered, is out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and everywhere else. So you can go and find out more about it there. And my social media is, I have such a ridiculous name that I'm pretty much Jono Bacon on most of the accounts as well. And I'm just spending a lot of time really just focusing on getting this broader message out about this value of community. I just co-wrote a Harvard Business Review piece, which has been doing great, and a lot of people have been reading that and kind of pulling people in, and just trying to really get that message out as broader as possible. And I think it's an exciting future. And Joe, thank you for having me on.
No, it's been great. I love talking with thought leaders like you and how we can figure out some things and getting you exposed to this space that I'm playing around in. Because a lot of people sort of know what's going on, but it's a little bit like the Wild West. Amazon has allowed, this whole new market to be created. There was these voracious readers that didn't have enough content, and there's people out there that weren't getting published. And if you're prepared to do the stuff we were talking about here, you find that audience, it's a match made in heaven.
Oh, yeah. It really is. There's tons of potential out there. So I'm hoping that some folks who are listening to this are going to give it a go. And I'm an open door. Let me know how you're getting on at jonobacon.com. So
awesome. Thanks for that offer, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks Joe.
a lot, Jono.
Take care.